When your spouse deploys, there are a lot of new, fun, and by that I mean terrible things to worry about, and a rush of plans to get everything into place. Your best bet is to get a power of attorney for the things that matter. You may choose to update your emergency contact information for yourself or your children. Some people even elect to move back to their hometowns during deployments, eager to return to a sense of comfort and community. It's a challenging time when the burden of running a life and a house shift to just one person, and frankly, it triggers survival mode. For one spouse, her deployment survival strategy expanded from the woes and worries of running their lives to include literal survival. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. William Henry Foster III joined the Army and soon found himself married and stationed at Fort Hood in 2008. But duty called. When he was deployed to Iraq, 22-ish-year-old Foster desperately needed more hobbies. Instead of diving into a new book series or perfecting his basketball form, Foster began to fixate on what his wife, Kaylee, might be up to back home. He concluded that Kaylee must be cheating with multiple men in his absence and reached out to his fellow soldier, Adam Richard Watson, to figure out his next steps. He was curious what $75,000 could buy. $75,000 that he would receive from an insurance payout if his wife died. In June 2008, Foster removed Kaylee from his life insurance policy, but a month later he added her back in and then reached out to Watson. While he was on leave, Watson and his wife, Chantal, drove to the Foster home on August 25, 2008 to scope it out. Nearby, investigators watched the couple and made preparations of their own. 3 days later, on August 28th, the Watsons were arrested. A confidential informant had learned of the murder plot and tipped off law enforcement officials. From the limited context clues I can gather, it sounds like that confidential informant may have also been stationed in Iraq. And I think it's pretty significant that there are so few limited context clues. This doesn't sound entirely dissimilar to Episode 2, The United States vs. Day. A service member plotting the death of their spouse and attempting to hire a hitman. But where Caitlin Day's case was all over the news, coverage of the Foster case is remarkably sparse. And because it's a circuit court opinion and not a criminal court of appeal for any of the armed forces, the opinion is similarly lacking in detail. About a week after the Watsons were arrested, U.S. Army officials in Iraq also arrested Foster for his role soliciting his wife's murder. All three faced a maximum penalty of life in prison. Chantal pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, admitting she was part of a murder-for-hire plot to kill Kaylee. She was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, 5 years of supervised release, and a $1,000 fine. Foster and Watson elected to proceed to trial, a trial in which Chantal testified against her husband and co-conspirator. Here come our context clues. 9 soldiers testified remotely from Baghdad, appearing virtually in the Texas court so they didn't have to be removed from Iraq for weeks to facilitate the trial. Reports don't share whether those soldiers would have preferred that time away from Iraq in 2008 and 2009. The jury convicted both Foster and Watson. During his sentencing argument, Foster maintained that he was innocent. In mitigation, he described his proud military service, a service that allowed him to form strong bonds with other soldiers. Bonds strong enough to solicit murder. He said that he hoped he'd be able to rejoin the army after serving whatever time was imposed upon him. He averred that everyone makes mistakes, including him, and he requested to be placed in a detention facility on the West Coast. Foster was sentenced to 25 years in prison and fined $5,000. He served at least some of that time at the United States Penitentiary Allenwood in White Deer, Pennsylvania. It's not clear whether he's gotten to spend any time in federal prison on the West Coast, like he requested. 13 years into his sentence, while he was devoting himself to rehabilitation and working towards one day rejoining the Army, Foster assaulted the Senior Bureau of Prisons officer in his housing unit. That officer had directed Foster to leave his housing unit, which some people might call a dorm or a cell, and Foster declined to do so. The officer attempted to physically remove Foster, causing Foster to become even more upset, and began punching the officer in the head and torso. That left the officer with abrasions on his left hand and his neck, along with a head contusion. If I thought there wasn't much coverage of the murder plot, there's certainly less coverage of this assault. So it's not clear if that officer was, for example, left-handed and that those abrasions were from perhaps fighting back. The DOJ prosecuted the assault, and Foster received a sentence of 12 months imprisonment to be served consecutively to his murder conspiracy sentence. In doing research for this episode, I found no less than 5 men named William Foster, and that includes variations like Willie, Will, Bill, Billy, who were all serving significant prison time for murder, attempted murder, or conspiracy to commit murder. So maybe, just maybe, if you're listening today and your last name is Foster, find a different first name for your sweet baby angel. For his part in the plot, Watson received a sentence of 19 years, 8 months confinement, and a $3,000 fine. Both Foster and Watson will be under 5 years of supervised release after they've completed their confinement terms. After their convictions, they were then separated from the Army. Before I flip us over to the brief review of the appeal I tracked down in this case, and together we lament the dearth of details a circuit court is required to use, I want to speak more generally about Fort Hood. The Post recently had an opportunity to rebrand and move away from a storied and frankly concerning past linked to Confederate generals and the Klan, but it's landed itself back at its original name. The bulk of the information in this section comes from a Vanity Fair article that I've linked in the show notes. I didn't want to pull too generally from the internet. I wanted information that had been vetted. My apologies to all the subreddits and wiki pages that I'm sidestepping in this discussion. The Foster murder plot took place in 2008 and was notably thwarted. But over time, the history of Fort Hood grew more sinister and investigations became murkier, for the lack of a better word. In 2016, one soldier was discovered dead in his pickup truck with a hose running from the exhaust pipe and into the truck cabin. The blanket stuffed alongside the hose, holding the hose in place, was covered in that soldier's blood. That blood was apparently the result of any of the 9 stab wounds he bore. His death was ruled a suicide. Later that same year, a soldier left his barracks to report for work less than a mile away. He never made it. A robust search turned up nothing until a land navigation exercise came across his body 2 miles away from his barracks room. His hyoid bone, usually used to determine if someone was strangled, was missing from his otherwise mostly intact body. Suspicious deaths and disappearances continued to accumulate. In 2020, at least 39 soldiers died or went missing at Fort Hood, a post that welcomes you to the Great Place at each gate. There were fewer casualties in Afghanistan and Iraq that year. And it's unclear whether dependents faced similar fates at similar rates. 1/3 of those soldiers' deaths were identified as death by suicide. 5 were ruled murders. A whopping 11 remained unsolved. The Vanity Fair article was quick to point out that the data isn't all that out of the ordinary for U.S. military bases. One of those murders in 2020 is a case that you're likely familiar with: the murder of Vanessa Guillen. It's not a case that I'm likely to cover because there was really no legal process involved. But it's a case that drew international attention, first because how does someone go missing during a nationwide COVID lockdown while they're on base among fellow soldiers? Soldiers who presumably have the best of intentions for them. Second, it became clear that the incident implicated gender-based violence and harassment in an organization and at a base in which 1/3 of women report experiencing sexual harassment. To take a 10,000-foot view on Fort Hood, it's a military base in a state that leans heavily into the Second Amendment while largely ignoring the First Amendment. But perhaps even more pertinently than being an armed population with ready access to guns, it's a population that, much like the rest of the United States, lacks adequate mental health support. Many young service members whose brains are still developing are indoctrinated into their roles in the military. They are often away from their traditional support systems, relying on what I'll call short-term friendships. Yes, people can form lifelong bonds, but it's also just as likely that after 1 to 3 years around someone, you never speak to them or see them again. It's a life built around impermanence, responsive to the needs of Uncle Sam. Service members, although individually talented, aren't really intended to stand out. There's a uniform and standards and a singular focus on the whole, not the individual. Add in exposure to violence or trauma, or the crushing isolation of a global pandemic, and it becomes a tinderbox for a mental health crisis. And when someone does experience a mental health crisis, there is a stigma for reaching out and asking for help because it could result in severing the one relationship that feels more permanent: their job. The Vanity Fair article discusses some of those concepts, some of the ways that those realities might affect the level of violence at Fort Hood. For their part, soldiers cite toxic leadership. They point to a lack of care, toxic masculinity, and even toxic mold exposure. When the Army investigated all those concerns, 14 officials were suspended or fired. That would seem to be a tacit acknowledgement that there were reasons to be concerned about Fort Hood. But it took a devastating murder becoming an international story to draw the Army's attention to the problem. But Fort Hood is just one base, a base that became the squeaky wheel. To the extent that Fort Hood doesn't actually statistically stand out, to the extent that it just seems like people die at a higher rate there because of the sheer number of soldiers stationed there, I would consider that a powerful indictment of leadership and culture. Foster and Watson jointly appealed their convictions to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal, the Federal Court of Appeals. Watson argued there was insufficient evidence to convict him for conspiracy to commit murder. Specifically, he challenged whether the acts he committed brought them closer to the object of the conspiracy, Kaylee's murder. Foster premised his appeal on Watson's, contending that if Watson's actions were insufficient to constitute overt acts towards the conspiracy, then the evidence was likewise insufficient to support his conviction. He also argued that the district court erred by imposing his sentence without giving specific reasons for the sentence or for rejecting his arguments for leniency, that being his desire to rejoin the Army one day and pointing at the rest of his Army career. The Fifth Circuit briefly reviewed the evidence of a conspiratorial agreement to commit murder, that is, the knowing and voluntary participation from both men in the conspiracy, and what seems to be Watson's sort of special order of certain items to commit the murder, which had prompted Watson to drive to an agreed-upon location and retrieve the bag with his murder tools. And it's this detail that they reference super vaguely that made me desperately wish they'd gone into more details in their opinion. I was unsuccessful in tracking down an appellant's brief or the government's response. The court also rejected Foster's argument regarding the lack of explanation for the district court's sentencing decision. While there was no specific reasoning included in the record, the circuit court concluded that Foster failed to show how a more thorough explanation would have resulted in a different sentence. It's probably worth observing right here that the sentence was within the sentencing guidelines range. Which is all to say, the Fifth Circuit affirmed the judgment and sentence. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to review the podcast wherever you listen. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time for a procedural history spanning a decade and a half. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense. Or, if we're going by their new preferred name and pronouns, the Department of War.